You are worthless. You are nobody. No man will want you.
The kick landed hard against her ribs, sending her stumbling backward into a display of designer handbags. Ryan Cole stood over his ex-wife with twisted satisfaction burning in his chest, his expensive Italian loafers still raised slightly from the impact. Around them, shoppers in the luxury mall froze, their shopping bags hanging forgotten in their hands as they witnessed something that would haunt this place forever. "That's what you get for thinking you belong here," Ryan spat, his voice dripping with venom that had festered for 3 long years. "If you ever wonder what happens when a man's cruelty catches up with him, stay with me because what's about to unfold will leave you speechless." This is the story of Ryan Cole, a man who abandoned his poor black ex-wife in poverty, convinced she would never rise again, only to discover that karma doesn't just knock, it kicks down the door. 3 years ago, Ryan walked out on Maya Bennett, leaving her with nothing but an empty apartment and a broken heart. But today, in this glittering shopping mall, his past was about to collide with a present he never saw coming. What Ryan didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have imagined as he stood there with his new girlfriend clinging to his arm, was that his ex-wife was now married to one of the most dangerous men in the city, and every security camera in this mall was already transmitting this moment to a man who made people disappear for far less. Maya didn't cry out when she hit the ground. She had learned long ago that tears were wasted on men like Ryan, men who measured worth in dollar signs and saw kindness as weakness to be exploited. The cold marble floor pressed against her palms as she pushed herself up her modest dress, a simple navy blue number that cost less than the coffee Ryan probably drank that morning, now smudged with dust from the display. Around her, the shocked silence began to crack as whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire, phones emerging from pockets and purses as people started recording what they sensed would become viral content. Ryan's girlfriend, a woman named Candace with bleached blonde hair and a designer outfit that screamed new money, giggled nervously beside him, clearly uncomfortable but too invested in her relationship with a successful man to speak up. Maya's dark eyes met Ryan's, and for just a moment, she saw the flash of something in his face that might have been doubt, might have been the last flicker of the man she once loved before he married her in a small ceremony 7 years ago. But that flicker died quickly, replaced by the same cold arrogance that had grown in him like a cancer after his business started taking off, after he decided that his black wife from the neighborhood wasn't sophisticated enough for his new circles, wasn't light-skinned enough for his new friends, wasn't willing to straighten her natural hair enough for his new corporate image. "You look even more pathetic than I remember," Ryan continued, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. He adjusted his Rolex, a deliberate gesture meant to remind her of everything she had lost when he kicked her out of their home 3 years ago, leaving her to scramble for a place to stay with exactly $73 in her bank account. The mall's vaulted ceiling echoed with his words, amplifying his cruelty for everyone to hear, and Maya noticed at least a dozen phones pointed in their direction now, recording every second of her humiliation. She stood slowly, deliberately, brushing off her dress with steady hands that refused to shake despite the pain blooming across her side where his kick had landed. Behind Ryan, past the crowds of shocked onlookers and the gleaming storefronts with their $1,000 price tags, Maya caught a glimpse of something that made her heart skip. A man in a sharp black suit speaking urgently into his phone, his eyes locked on Ryan with an intensity that promised consequences. She knew that suit, knew the subtle insignia on the lapel that marked him as one of Kenji's men, and she felt a cold sense of inevitability settling over the scene like fog rolling in from the ocean. Ryan took a step closer, emboldened by the crowd's silence and Candace's nervous laughter, his chest puffed with the kind of pride that comes before a devastating fall. "I heard you were working at some little community center now, teaching kids or some shit," he said, his tone making it clear what he thought of such work, how far beneath him he considered it compared to his real estate empire. What Ryan didn't know was that Maya had chosen that job, had turned down more lucrative offers because she wanted to give back to the neighborhood that had caught her when she fell, wanted to be the support for others that she had desperately needed when Ryan abandoned her. He didn't know that she volunteered extra hours, that she had helped 17 kids get college scholarships in the past 2 years, that the community center had named a wing after her family once her new husband's foundation made an anonymous donation that transformed the entire building. Maya's silence seemed to infuriate him further, and he reached out to grab her arm, his fingers closing around her wrist with enough force to leave marks, enough force to make this assault and not just verbal abuse. The crowd gasped collectively, and somewhere in the distance, Maya heard the distinct sound of running footsteps, multiple pairs moving with military precision through the mall's corridors. "Take your hands off me, Ryan," Maya said quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling around them. Her words carried a weight that made several people in the crowd shiver, though they couldn't have explained why this abandoned woman's quiet command felt more threatening than any scream. Ryan laughed, actually laughed, and tightened his grip, his face contorted with the rage of a man who felt his ex-wife owed him eternal gratitude for the 3 years he had kept her fed and housed before discarding her. "Oh, what? You gonna call your little community center friends? Gonna have some broke do-gooders come save you?" His mockery rang hollow in the space, and that's when the footsteps stopped, and that's when Ryan finally noticed the men in black suits forming a loose circle around them, their faces professionally blank but their eyes promising violence. That's when the manager of the luxury store whose display Maya had knocked into came rushing over, his face pale as paper, saying, "Oh my God, sir, please, you don't understand who she is. You need to let her go right now." That's when Ryan Cole's world began to crumble, standing in that mall with his hand still wrapped around his ex-wife's wrist, surrounded by men whose very presence made his new girlfriend whimper and back away, finally understanding that he had made a mistake that would cost him everything. Will Ryan release Maya before it's too late, or has he already sealed his fate? Don't go anywhere. Next chapter will reveal the truth about Maya's new life and the man who now controls Ryan's destiny. If you're hooked on this story, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss what happens next. 3 years ago, Maya Bennett had stood in the rain outside the apartment she had shared with Ryan Cole, watching through blurred vision as the locks were changed by a man who wouldn't meet her eyes. The eviction notice clutched in her trembling hand had been the first indication that Ryan wasn't coming back, that the business trip he'd mentioned 2 weeks earlier was actually his escape from a marriage he had grown to resent. She remembered the exact weight of her suitcase that night, 37 pounds of everything she owned after Ryan had cleared out their joint bank account, canceled her credit cards, and left her with nothing but the clothes she had packed for what she thought was a temporary stay at her mother's house. The rain had soaked through her jacket as she sat on the curb, calling friends who didn't answer, family members who had warned her about Ryan but now felt too much like saying, "I told you so," to offer real help. If you ever felt completely alone in the world, abandoned by the person who promised to love you forever, then you understand the darkness that swallowed Maya that night. But here's what makes this story worth telling. Sometimes the worst moment of your life is actually the doorway to your greatest transformation, and Maya's journey from that rain-soaked curb to becoming the wife of one of the city's most powerful men is a testament to resilience that will inspire you to keep watching. The community center had saved her life, though Maya didn't realize it immediately when she first walked through its doors looking for their emergency assistant program. Sister Margaret, the center's director, had taken one look at Maya's hollow eyes and rain-damaged suitcase and offered her more than just a hot meal and a temporary bed. She offered her purpose. Within a week, Maya was volunteering during the day while working night shifts at a diner, pouring everything she had into helping kids from the neighborhood navigate the same kind of poverty and abandonment she was experiencing. The work was exhausting, the kind of bone-deep tiredness that comes from running on hope and coffee, but it filled something in her that Ryan's money and empty promises never had. She remembered the first time a teenage girl named Jasmine had hugged her after Maya helped her fill out college applications, how that simple gesture of gratitude had made her feel more valued than any expensive gift Ryan had ever bought her. Those months of struggle had stripped away the woman Ryan had tried to mold her into, the one who straightened her natural hair every week, who spoke softer around his business associates, who made herself smaller to fit his vision of success. In the community center's crowded rooms and chaotic after-school programs, Maya rediscovered the woman she had been before Ryan, the one who laughed loud and loved hard and didn't apologize for taking up space. She met Kenji Takahashi on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when nothing about the day suggested her entire life was about to change forever. He had walked into the community center wearing a suit that probably cost more than Maya made in 6 months, looking completely out of place among the worn furniture and hand-painted motivational posters that decorated the walls. Sister Margaret had introduced him as a potential donor, a businessman interested in supporting their youth programs, and Maya had shaken his hand with the practiced professionalism she had developed from months of fundraising attempts that usually went nowhere. What she didn't know then was that Kenji had been watching the community center for weeks, drawn by reports of a woman who worked 18-hour days and turned down every man who asked her out because she was too focused on rebuilding her life. He had seen her through the windows, teaching kids math and confidence in equal measure, and something about her strength in the face of obvious hardship had intrigued him in ways his dangerous world rarely allowed. Their first conversation had lasted 3 hours, starting with budget discussions and ending with Maya sharing stories about the kids she worked with, her passion making her forget that this man in the expensive suit might judge her for her enthusiasm. Kenji had listened with an intensity that made her nervous, his dark eyes never leaving her face. And when he left that day, he had written a check that saved the community center from closure and asked if he could take her to dinner to discuss future partnerships. The courtship had been unlike anything Maya had experienced with Ryan, who had pursued her in college with grand gestures and empty words that masked his shallow commitment. Kenji moved slowly, deliberately, showing up at the community center week after week, always respectful, always interested in her work before anything personal. He never flashed his wealth the way Ryan had, never used money as leverage or gift-giving as manipulation, and it took Maya 3 months to even learn the full extent of his business empire. When she finally discovered the truth about who Kenji really was, not just a successful businessman, but a Japanese mafia boss who controlled half the city's underground economy, she had been terrified enough to end things immediately. She remembered sitting across from him in his office, seeing for the first time the gun in his desk drawer during a moment when he thought she wasn't looking, understanding that the gentleman who helped teenagers with their homework was also someone who made people disappear. But Kenji had been honest when she confronted him, brutally honest in ways Ryan never was, explaining his world without sugarcoating the violence, offering her the choice to walk away with no consequences and a promise that he would continue supporting the community center regardless. That honesty, that respect for her agency after Ryan had spent years making decisions without her input, had been what made her stay for one more conversation, then another, then eventually agreed to marry him 6 months later in a private ceremony that blended her Christian faith with his Japanese traditions. Now, standing in that luxury mall with Ryan's hand still gripping her wrist, Maya thought about how far she had traveled from that rain-soaked curb 3 years ago. She wore simple clothes not because she couldn't afford designer labels, but because she chose to, because the woman she had become valued substance over style and knew that true wealth was measured in the lives you touched, not the price tags you wore. The community center kids called her Mrs. T now, unaware that the woman who brought them snacks and helped them with college essays went home to a man whose name made criminals nervous and whose protection meant she could walk safely through neighborhoods where even police feared to patrol. Kenji had never asked her to change, never demanded she straighten her hair or soften her voice or become anything other than exactly who she was, and that acceptance had healed wounds Ryan had carved so deep she thought they would never close. She had built a life of purpose and love from absolute nothing, had transformed her pain into power that helped others rise from their own struggles, and now Ryan stood before her, completely ignorant of the fact that his casual cruelty in this public space had triggered a response from an organization that didn't forgive disrespect to their boss's wife. As the men in black suits tightened their circle and the mall manager pleaded with Ryan to release her, Maya felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. She felt genuinely sorry for the man who had destroyed her, because she knew what was coming next, and unlike him, she understood that some mistakes carry consequences that money and arrogance cannot fix. What will Kenji do when he arrives at the mall? And how will Ryan react when he discovers his ex-wife's new reality? Next chapter brings a confrontation you've been waiting for. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications on because you won't want to miss the moment Ryan's world completely falls apart. The temperature in the mall seemed to drop 10 degrees when Kenji Tokahashi walked through the entrance, his presence commanding attention without him uttering a single word. He moved like violence contained in an expensive suit, each step measured and deliberate, his dark eyes scanning the crowd until they locked onto the scene unfolding near the designer handbag display. Ryan still had his hand wrapped around Maya's wrist, too absorbed in his own sense of superiority to notice that every security guard in the mall had suddenly become very interested in their phones, or that shoppers were backing away from a confrontation with the instinctive fear of prey sensing a predator nearby. If you thought Chapter 1 was intense, buckle up because what's about to happen will redefine everything you thought you knew about consequences and karma. Kenji's men had formed a perfect perimeter around Ryan and his girlfriend Candace, their positioning so subtle that Ryan still hadn't registered the danger he was in, still thought he was the most powerful person in this scenario because his real estate business had made him wealthy by conventional standards. But conventional wealth meant nothing in the world Kenji controlled, where power was measured not in property portfolios but in the ability to make problems disappear. And right now, Ryan Cole had become the biggest problem Kenji had encountered in months. The crowd parted like water as Kenji approached, and Maya felt the shift in atmosphere before she even saw her husband, felt the way the air itself seemed to bend around his authority. "Remove your hand from my wife." Kenji's voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty that his command would be obeyed. Ryan's head snapped around, his grip on Maya's wrist loosening slightly as he took in the man standing behind him, not particularly tall, but radiating danger the way some people radiate warmth, everything about him screaming carefully controlled violence. For the first time since he kicked Maya, Ryan felt a flutter of genuine fear in his chest, some primitive part of his brain recognizing that he had made a terrible miscalculation. Candace had already backed away completely, her designer purse clutched to her chest like a shield, her face drained of color as she realized that her boyfriend had somehow managed to assault someone important, someone protected. "Who the hell are you?" Ryan demanded, but his voice cracked slightly, betraying the confidence he was desperately trying to project. Kenji didn't answer immediately, instead moving to Maya's side with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with a threat emanating from every other part of his being, his hand coming to rest on the small of her back in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. Maya leaned into him slightly, and Ryan watched this interaction with growing confusion and dread, his mind struggling to process how his poor, abandoned ex-wife had somehow ended up with a man who made a security team look like children playing dress-up. "I'm the man who's going to teach you about consequences," Kenji said finally, his English perfect but colored with an accent that made certain words sound like threats even when they were simply statements of fact. He gestured with one hand, a subtle motion that Ryan barely noticed, but that made two of the suited men step forward, their jackets falling open just enough to reveal shoulder holsters that ended any illusion this was a normal confrontation. Ryan released Maya's wrist like it had burned him, stumbling backward into a display of luxury watches, his expensive shoes squeaking on the polished marble floor. The mall manager appeared at Kenji's elbow, practically bowing, stammering apologies about the incident and assurances that mall security had already pulled footage of the assault. Around them, phones continued recording, capturing every moment of Ryan's humiliation for the internet to devour, though several people found their devices suddenly malfunctioning as Kenji's technical team remotely disabled cameras that had caught too clear a view of their boss's face. "Maya, are you hurt?" Kenji asked, his voice softening as he turned his full attention to his wife, checking the spot where Ryan's kick had landed with gentle fingers that had broken bones in other contexts. She shook her head, though they both knew she would have bruises, and Kenji's jaw tightened in a way that made the surrounding guards shift their weight, recognizing the signs that their boss was about to make an example of someone. Ryan found his voice again, though it emerged higher than he intended, panic beginning to override his pride. "Look, man, I don't know who you think you are, but this is between me and my ex-wife," he said, gesturing at Maya like she was a possession he had temporarily misplaced rather than a human being he had abused. The words had barely left his mouth when one of Kenji's men moved forward and backhanded Ryan across the face with casual efficiency, the slap echoing through the mall like a gunshot. Candace screamed, her heels clicking rapidly against the floor as she tried to run but found her path blocked by another suited figure who appeared from nowhere. "Your ex-wife," Kenji repeated, tasting the words like they were poison, his dark eyes boring into Ryan with an intensity that made grown men confess to crimes they hadn't committed. "You kicked my wife, Ryan Cole of Cole Properties, who lives at 2847 Riverside Drive in the penthouse you purchased 8 months ago with a mortgage from First National Bank." The specificity of the information made Ryan's blood turn to ice, the realization dawning that this wasn't a random encounter but something planned, something inevitable. Kenji had known exactly who Ryan was before he even entered the mall, had probably known the moment his security team alerted him that someone was assaulting Maya, and the fact that he could recite Ryan's address and business details meant he had access to information that should have been private. "Here's what's going to happen," Kenji continued, his tone remaining conversational even as he described Ryan's immediate future with the detached precision of a surgeon explaining a procedure. "First, you're going to apologize to Maya for every moment of suffering you caused her during your marriage and after you abandoned her. Then, you're going to transfer ownership of 3 properties to the community center where my wife works. Not sell them, transfer them, because I don't want your money. I want you to feel what she felt when you left her with nothing." Ryan opened his mouth to protest, to argue that this was insane, that Kenji couldn't just demand property transfers like ordering coffee. But the look on the man's face stopped him cold. This wasn't a negotiation, wasn't a discussion between equals, and somewhere in Ryan's privileged, entitled mind, the survival instinct that had atrophied during his years of easy success suddenly kicked back to life. He looked around desperately for help, for more security or police or anyone who might intervene, but every authority figure had mysteriously disappeared, and the crowd of onlookers had their phones pointed at him like weapons, recording his downfall for an audience that would show him no mercy. Candace was crying now, makeup running down her face, and when Ryan reached for her, she flinched away from him like he carried a contagious disease. That's when Ryan Cole finally understood that everything he had built, every illusion of power and success he had constructed on the ruins of his marriage to Maya, was about to come crashing down. And the man orchestrating his destruction was doing it with the same calm efficiency some people use to plan dinner parties. Will Ryan comply with Kenji's demands, or will his pride lead to even worse consequences? Next chapter reveals the full extent of Ryan's reckoning and a betrayal he never saw coming. Don't forget to like this video and drop a comment telling me if you think Ryan deserves what's happening to him. I read every single one. Ryan sat in his penthouse at night, staring at the property transfer document spread across his glass coffee table like evidence of his own execution. His face still stung from the slap he had received in the mall, but that pain was nothing compared to the humiliation of kneeling before Maya and apologizing while hundreds of phones recorded every word, every tear that he couldn't hold back when Kenji's men made it clear that refusing wasn't an option. The video had already gone viral, with over 2 million views in just 6 hours, comments flooding in from people who recognized him from his real estate commercials and delighted in watching his public destruction. If you ever wonder what it feels like to lose everything in a single afternoon, to watch your carefully constructed life disintegrate in real time, then you need to hear what happened next because Ryan's nightmare was just beginning. His phone had been ringing non-stop since he left the mall, business partners suddenly remembering prior commitments, investors concerned about his judgment, clients requesting different agents to handle their million-dollar properties. Candace had broken up with him via text message before they even made it back to his car. Her final words a cool echo of things he had said to Maya years ago about not wanting to be associated with someone who embarrassed her publicly. The 3 properties Kenji had demanded represented almost 40% of Ryan's total portfolio, buildings he had leveraged heavily to finance his lifestyle and expansion plans, and transferring them to the community center would leave him financially crippled, unable to make payments on his remaining mortgages, facing bankruptcy within months. But it wasn't just a financial devastation that kept Ryan awake as night fell over the city and his penthouse filled with shadows that seemed to mock his downfall. It was the realization of what he had thrown away, what he had destroyed with his own hands when he abandoned Maya 3 years ago. He pulled up old photos on his phone, pictures from their wedding day when she had smiled at him like he was her entire world, images from their early years together when they were broke but happy, living in a tiny apartment and dreaming about the future they would build together. Maya had supported him through business school, working 2 jobs so he could focus on his studies, never complaining about the sacrifices she made even when it meant skipping meals or wearing the same 3 outfits on rotation because they couldn't afford more. She had believed in him when his own family doubted, had celebrated every small victory and encouraged him through every setback, her faith in his potential unwavering even when banks rejected his loan applications and potential partners dismissed his ideas. And how had he repaid that devotion? by slowly poisoning their relationship with resentment and shame, by starting to see her love as an anchor holding him back rather than the foundation that made his success possible, by convincing himself that he deserved better than a woman who reminded him too much of where he came from. The betrayal hadn't started with the abandonment. Ryan realized as he poured himself another drink he didn't need and wouldn't enjoy. It had started years earlier, in small moments he barely remembered, but that must have cut Maya like 1,000 tiny knives. There was a time he asked her not to come to his company Christmas party because his colleagues would be bringing wives who, as he put it, dressed more professionally, code for lighter-skinned, straight-ahead, more acceptable to the white clients he was desperately trying to impress. There was a morning he told her to stop laughing so loud because the neighbors in a new upscale building might complain, as if her joy was something shameful that needed to be contained. There were the countless dinners with potential investors where he introduced her as briefly as possible, sometimes forgetting to mention her name at all, treating her like an accessory he was obligated to bring rather than his partner in everything he had achieved. He had watched her shrink over those 2 years, had seen the light in her eyes dim as she tried to become whatever version of herself he seemed to want that particular week, and instead of recognizing what he was doing to her, he had blamed her for not transforming fast enough, not fitting seamlessly into the life he was building on top of her sacrifices. The knock on his door at midnight made Ryan jump, spilling bourbon across the property documents and his expensive area rug. He approached the door with trembling hands, half expecting to find Kenji's men there to deliver more consequences, but instead found his business partner Marcus standing in the hallway with an expression that mixed pity and disgust in equal measure. Marcus pushed past him without invitation, his movements sharp would barely contain anger, and Ryan knew before a single word was spoken that this visit would end with another piece of his life crumbling away. "The board met tonight," Marcus said without preamble, his voice flat and professional in a way that hurt worse than shouting would have. "We're buying you out of Cole Properties effective immediately. The contract is already drawn up, and your lawyer has reviewed it. You'll get 30 cents on the dollar for your shares, and you'll resign from all positions, including your seat on the board." Ryan felt the room tilt, his hand reaching for the back of the couch to steady himself as he processed what this meant. Cole Properties was his namesake company, the business he had built from nothing, and they were forcing him out like he was toxic waste that needed to be disposed of before contaminating everyone else. Marcus pulled out a folder and dropped it on the coffee table next to the property transfer documents, creating a pile of papers that represented the complete dismantling of everything Ryan had sacrificed his marriage to achieve. "Why?" Ryan whispered, though he already knew the answer, could see it in the way Marcus wouldn't meet his eyes, in the tight set of his former friend's jaw. "Because we can't afford to be associated with you anymore," Marcus replied, his word precise and cutting, each one landing like a physical blow. "The video of you kicking your ex-wife has 8 million views now. People are showing up at our office to protest. Major clients are threatening to walk unless we distance ourselves from you immediately. And that's before we even get into whoever that man was at the mall, the one whose wife you assaulted." Marcus paused, pulling out his phone and showing Ryan a photo that made his blood run cold, an image of Kenji at some formal event, surrounded by men in expensive suits, the caption identifying him as someone connected to organized crime, someone that legitimate businesses avoided at all costs. "You kicked the wife of Kenji Takahashi," Marcus continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you understand that every business in this city will blacklist us if we don't cut ties with you immediately?" Ryan collapsed onto his couch, the weight of his mistakes crushing down on him with force that made his earlier humiliation seem trivial. He had lost his girlfriend, his company, his properties, and his reputation in less than 12 hours, but as Marcus dropped the buyout contract on his lap and walked toward the door without another word, Ryan realized that his punishment was far from over, and that the man he had become, the one who valued money and status over love and loyalty, was about to lose even more than he ever thought possible. Ryan's world is falling apart piece by piece, but is this the end of his suffering or just the beginning? Next chapter takes us deeper into the consequences of his actions and reveals a shocking connection that changes everything. Smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications because the next chapter will blow your mind. The eviction notice arrived exactly 1 week after the mall incident, delivered by a sheriff's deputy who wouldn't make eye contact as he handed Ryan the papers that officially made him homeless. Ryan stood in the doorway of the penthouse that was no longer his, the morning sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased a view of the city he could no longer afford to see, and felt the universe's sense of irony cutting into him like broken glass. This was exactly what he had done to Maya 3 years ago, down to the sympathetic but firm deputy who had no choice but to enforce the law regardless of how it felt. If you thought Ryan had hit rock bottom in the last chapter, you haven't seen anything yet, because what's about to unfold will show you that karma doesn't just knock you down. It makes sure you understand exactly how your victims felt. The bank had foreclosed on the penthouse after Ryan missed 2 mortgage payments. His buyout money from Cole Properties already consumed by desperate attempts to save his remaining properties and pay off the investors who were now demanding their money back immediately, threatening lawsuits that would drain whatever pennies he had left. His luxury car had been repossessed 3 days ago, towed from the parking garage while he slept, leaving him dependent on rideshare apps driven by people who sometimes recognize him from a viral video and ask pointed questions about what kind of man kicks his ex-wife in public. Everything Ryan had built, every symbol of success he had accumulated to prove he was better than his humble beginnings, had been systematically stripped away, and he was living the nightmare he had once inflicted without remorse. Ryan moved what remained of his possessions into a cheap motel on the edge of town, the kind of place where the neon sign flickered and the walls were thin enough to hear every argument and desperate phone call from neighbors who were also clinging to the bottom rung of survival. He had exactly $4,300 left in his checking account, money that would last perhaps 2 months if he was careful, if he stopped eating anything that wasn't instant noodles or convenience store sandwiches. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now living worse than Maya had been when he abandoned her, that she had somehow climbed out of this pit while he was actively sinking deeper into it. His phone had become a source of constant anxiety rather than the lifeline to opportunity it once represented, filled with messages from creditors and former associates who wanted nothing to do with him, the occasional interview request from tabloid journalists who saw his downfall as entertainment rather than tragedy. At night, lying on a mattress that smelled faintly of cigarettes and broken dreams, Ryan would replay the mall incident over and over, searching for the moment he could have made a different choice, the second way he could have walked away instead of letting his pride and resentment guide his actions. But that moment didn't exist, because the truth was that kicking Maya hadn't been an impulsive decision, but the culmination of years of viewing her as less than human, as an obstacle to his success rather than the person who had made that success possible. The call came on a Thursday afternoon while Ryan was sitting in a coffee shop he couldn't afford, nursing a small black coffee for 3 hours because he had nowhere else to go and the motel room felt like a prison cell. An unknown number flashed across his screen, and something made him answer despite his policy of avoiding calls from people he didn't recognize. "Mr. Cole, this is Detective Sharon Williams from the Fraud Division," a woman's voice said, professional and detached in a way that made Ryan's stomach drop even before she explained why she was calling. "We've received information regarding some irregularities in your business dealings over the past 3 years, specifically related to property acquisitions and client fund management. We need you to come down to the station to answer some questions." Ryan's hand started shaking so badly he almost dropped the phone, his mind racing through every shortcut he had taken, every corner he had cut, every ethical line he had blurred in his desperate climb to the top. There had been deals that weren't quite legal, investor money that he had temporarily borrowed without permission, property inspections he had falsified to close sales faster. Nothing he thought would ever come back to haunt him, because successful people didn't get investigated for the same things that poor people went to prison for. But apparently someone had been looking very carefully at his business records. Someone with the resources and motivation to dig up every skeleton Ryan had buried in his rush to build an empire that would impress people who never really cared about him anyway. He knew immediately who was behind the investigation, whose quiet influence had prompted law enforcement to suddenly take an interest in Ryan Cole's questionable business practices. Kenji Takahashi didn't need to hurt people physically when he could destroy them systematically through legal channels, using his connections and resources to ensure that justice, so often blind to the crimes of the wealthy, suddenly had perfect vision when it came to the man who had assaulted his wife. Ryan stumbled out of the coffee shop and vomited in the alley behind the building, his body rejecting the reality of what was coming with the same violence he had once directed at Maya. Criminal charges meant prison time, meant losing not just his business and properties, but his actual freedom, meant becoming the kind of person society locked away and forgot about. The detective had mentioned specific dates and transactions, details that meant someone had provided them with inside information, and Ryan realized with growing horror that this was why Marcus had been so quick to force him out of Cole Properties. His former partner must have known that an investigation was coming, must have been cooperating with authorities to save himself, willing to sacrifice Ryan to protect the company they had built together. The betrayal stung worse than any of the financial losses, worse even than the public humiliation, because Marcus had been his friend since college, had been the best man at his wedding to Maya, and was now the person ensuring that Ryan would face consequences that went far beyond losing money and status. Back in his motel room, Ryan sat on the edge of his bed and made a decision that 3 weeks ago would have been unthinkable. He needed to contact Maya. Not to apologize, though he owed her 1,000 apologies that words could never adequately express, but because she was the only person who might have influence with Kenji, the only one who could possibly convince her husband to call the legal assault that was about to send Ryan to prison. He drafted and deleted a dozen text messages, each one sounding more desperate and pathetic than the last, his pride warring with his survival instinct in a battle that his ego was finally losing. Finally, he wrote something simple. Maya, I know I have no right to ask anything from you, but I need to talk. Please. I'm sorry for everything. He stared at the message for 15 minutes before hitting send, watching the delivered notification appear and then waiting in agony for a response that might never come. Hours passed with his phone clutched in his hand, every notification making his heart race only to crash when it was just another creditor or curious journalist. Then, just before midnight, 3 dots appeared indicating that Maya was typing, and Ryan held his breath like a drowning man waiting to see if the person above water would throw him a rope or let him sink. Her response was brief, just an address and a time, tomorrow at 2 p.m., but it was more than he deserved, more than he had any right to expect, and as he fell asleep that night for the first time in days without anxiety medication, Ryan allowed himself the dangerous luxury of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward that didn't end with him behind bars paying for sins he could finally admit he had committed. Will Maya help the man who destroyed her, or will she watch him fall even further? The final chapter brings this emotional saga to its stunning conclusion. If you've made it this far, you need to see how this ends. Next chapter is coming up next, and I promise you won't see this ending coming. Hit like if you're invested in this story. The address Maya had sent led Ryan to the community center where she worked, a building he had never visited during their marriage despite her countless invitations to see the place that meant so much to her. He arrived 30 minutes early, sitting in a rideshare car for 20 of those minutes, building up the courage to face a woman he had destroyed and beg for mercy he didn't deserve. The center looked different than he had imagined, newer, better maintained, with a fresh coat of paint and a sign out front that read Bennett Takahashi Youth Center, Maya's maiden name combined with her new husband's in a declaration of partnership that Ryan's own marriage had never achieved. If you've been with this story from the beginning, watching Ryan fall from grace and Maya's rise from the ashes, then you know this final chapter is going to deliver the closure and justice we've all been waiting for. Ryan walked through the doors into a lobby filled with the sound of children's laughter echoing from deeper in the building. Teenagers gathered around computers in a modern tech lab visible through glass walls, everything about this place radiating the kind of genuine success that couldn't be measured in property values or bank accounts. A young girl at the front desk looked up from her homework, recognized him from the viral video, and her expression shifted from welcoming to guarded in an instant. She picked up a phone without asking his name, spoke quietly to someone, and within moments Maya appeared from a hallway wearing jeans and a center t-shirt, looking more at peace than Ryan had ever seen her during their marriage. Maya led him to a small office without saying a word, her movement efficient and professional, giving him no indication of what to expect from this conversation. Ryan sat in the chair she gestured to, his hands clasped between his knees like a child called to the principal's office, and waited for her to speak first because he had lost the right to control any interaction between them. She studied him for a long moment, taking in his wrinkled clothes and the way weight had fallen off him from stress and poor nutrition, the dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and crushing anxiety. Finally, she said, "You look like I felt 3 years ago when you had me evicted. and the observation landed with the force of a punch because it was simple truth delivered without malice or satisfaction. Ryan nodded, unable to meet her eyes, shame burning through him in ways that public humiliation and financial ruin never quite achieved. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and the words felt pathetically inadequate, like bringing a Band-Aid to someone whose legs you had broken and expecting them to thank you for the gesture. Maya didn't respond immediately, instead pulling out a folder from her desk drawer and sliding it across to him, her expression unreadable as Ryan opened it with trembling hands. Inside were documents related to the fraud investigation, detailed records of every illegal transaction he had made, every corner he had cut, every law he had broken, evidence that would send him to prison for years if it reached a prosecutor. "Kenji had his people pull your entire business history the day after the mall incident," Maya explained, her voice steady and calm, the voice of someone who had processed a trauma and come out stronger rather than bitter. "He wanted to know everything about the man who hurt me, wanted to understand how someone I once loved could become someone who would kick me in public like I was garbage. What he found was a pattern of fraud going back almost to the day you left me, illegal deals you made to maintain a lifestyle you couldn't actually afford, investors you cheated, clients you manipulated." Ryan felt tears sliding down his face, not from self-pity but from the crushing weight of having every secret exposed, every shameful action documented and presented by the woman who had once believed he was a good man. "He wanted to destroy you completely," Maya continued, and something in her tone made Ryan look up, meeting her eyes for the first time since entering the office. "He wanted to send you to prison, to make sure you understood that actions have consequences, that hurting people, especially people under your protection, comes with a price that money can't pay." The past tense of her words registered slowly, and Ryan felt a dangerous flutter of hope before Maya's next words crushed it. "I told him no," she said simply, and the world seemed to stop spinning for a moment as Ryan processed what she had just revealed. The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of hurt and betrayal and the complicated reality that love doesn't always die cleanly even when it should. Maya stood and walked to the window overlooking the center's playground, where kids were playing basketball on a new court that Ryan's transferred properties had helped fund. "I told him no because sending you to prison doesn't heal anything in me that's still broken," she said, her back to Ryan as she spoke. "It doesn't undo the nights I spent crying in homeless shelters or the humiliation of calling everyone I knew to beg for help that never came. It doesn't erase the way you made me feel worthless and small, and like everything about me needed to be fixed or hidden." Her words cut deeper than any legal consequence could have, forcing Ryan to confront not just what he had done but what it had cost a woman who had given him everything. "But I also told him no because I'm not the woman you left behind in the mall. I don't need revenge to feel powerful, don't need to what you suffered to know my worth." She turned to face him then, and Ryan saw something in her expression that broke him more completely than anger or hatred ever could. He saw pity, the look someone gives a person who has destroyed themselves through their own choices. "Kenji respected my decision because he loves me enough to let me choose mercy even when he wanted justice," Maya continued, and the implicit comparison to their marriage hung in the air unspoken but devastatingly clear. "The investigation will be dropped," Maya said, returning to her desk and pulling out another document that Ryan recognized as some kind of legal agreement. "Kenji has connections in law enforcement that owe him favors, and is calling them in on your behalf because I ask him to. You won't go to prison for your fraud, won't face criminal charges that would end any chance you have of rebuilding your life." Ryan's relief was so intense it made him dizzy, but Maya held up a hand before he could speak, before he could thank her or promise to change or say any of the meaningless things people say when granted mercy they don't deserve. "But there are conditions," she continued, her tone becoming harder, more businesslike. "You will complete 200 hours of community service at this center, working with the same kids and families you used to look down on. You will attend therapy twice a week to address whatever broke inside you that made cruelty feel justified. You will sell whatever properties you have left and donate half the proceeds to organizations that help women escaping domestic situations. Financial abuse is still abuse, Ryan, even if you never hit me until that day in the mall." Each condition was another piece of the life he had known being dismantled, but Ryan found himself nodding, accepting terms that 3 weeks ago would have seemed like punishment but now felt like an unexpected lifeline. And finally, Maya said, her voice softening slightly, you will never contact me again after the day unless it's related to your community service work here. Kenji is giving you a chance because I asked. But that doesn't mean we're going to be friends or that I owe you anything beyond this one act of mercy. You need to move forward with your life and let me live mine in peace. Ryan signed the agreement with shaking hands, his signature making official his acceptance of a future that looked nothing like what he had imagined 3 weeks ago when he was still wealthy and arrogant and blind to the cost of his cruelty. As he stood to leave, Maya handed him one final document, a letter of recommendation for a property management position at a small firm across town, a job that would pay enough for rent and food but would never restore the empire he had lost. The owner is someone who believes in second chances, Maya explained, her kindness in this moment almost unbearable for Ryan to accept. He knows your history, knows what you did, and is still willing to give you an opportunity if you're willing to do the work and be honest about your past mistakes. Ryan clutched the letter like it was a winning lottery ticket, though he knew it represented something far more valuable, a chance to rebuild not his fortune but his character, to become someone whose success wasn't built on the ruins of other people's pain. As he walked out of the community center into afternoon sunlight that felt warmer than it had any right to, Ryan turned back to see Maya standing in the doorway, her hand resting protectively on her stomach in a gesture he didn't understand until he saw the slight swell beneath her t-shirt that indicated new life growing. She was pregnant, moving forward into a future filled with love and family and everything Ryan had taken for granted and thrown away, and the image of her standing there surrounded by the kids she helped and the community she served burned itself into his memory as a reminder of who he needed to become. 6 months later, Ryan stood in that same community center teaching a financial literacy class to teenagers who reminded him uncomfortably of his younger self, ambitious, hungry for success, willing to do whatever it took to escape poverty. But now, instead of teaching them the shortcuts and ethical compromises that had led to his downfall, he taught them about integrity and the long-term cost of short-term thinking, about building wealth that didn't require stepping on other people to achieve. He had completed his community service hours, attended every therapy session even when facing his own demons felt impossible, and slowly, painfully, begun the work of becoming someone he didn't hate when he looked in the mirror. He lived in a modest apartment, drove a used car, and earned enough to support himself without the luxury he had once thought was essential to happiness. The viral video of his humiliation still circulated occasionally, and people still recognized him sometimes, but the shame that had once consumed him had transformed into something that looked almost like humility, an acceptance that his past would always be part of him but didn't have to define his future. One afternoon, he saw Maya in the hallway with a baby in her arms, her face glowing with the kind of joy that comes from being loved well and loving authentically in return, and their eyes met for just a moment before she nodded slightly and continued on her way. That small acknowledgement, neither friendship nor forgiveness, but simple recognition that they had both survived their shared history, was more than Ryan had hoped for and exactly what he needed, permission to finally let go of who he had been and embrace the harder work of becoming who he should have been all along. And that's where Ryan's story ends, not with revenge or destruction, but with a harder justice of having to become a better person. Maya found her happy ending with Kenji and their new family, while Ryan found something more valuable than wealth, a second chance at redemption. If this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe for more emotional stories, and drop a comment telling me what you think Ryan's biggest mistake was. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, the consequences of our actions may be harsh, but mercy and growth are always possible if we're willing to do the work. I'll see you in the next story.